So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. Again, I'm Jamie Moeller, and this is the Grad Connection, where my whole point is to try to help graduate students expand, grow, and quite frankly, to suck less. But really, I want to see you thrive rather than just trying to survive in graduate school, which a lot of times I know it feels like you are. So last few weeks, I've been doing the Teaching Assistant series. I think I'm going to bring it to a close with this video. I kind of have a hodgepodge of like 3 topics that I want to cover. And these are kind of like my perspectives on it, but I think they're things that you wrestle with or deal with. I want to talk about dealing with behavioral issues in the classroom. I want to talk about relating to your students and kind of, the relationship part of that. And then also just talk about office hours and kind of things there relative to that. And we'll kind of close this out. Now, what I will say, if anybody has, particular perspectives on, something that I can talk about that would help you, be more than willing to do that. We can do it in a private way, or if it's a big enough topic and I think it's worth a video, I certainly could do that as well. So I really am here to try to help you hone your teaching chops, as it were, and to try to help you along in that way. So let's talk about the very first one, dealing with behavioral issues. This is one of the things that I always worried about, particularly as a graduate student coming right out of a bachelor's degree in the same program, because you're trying to separate yourself as a graduate student from undergraduate land. Same thing if you're a PhD. Basically, I went all the way from undergraduate to faculty in one department. And so one of the things I always struggled with, whether anybody knew it or not, was kind of this idea of trying to, how do I transition or mature in this and create separation between me and, honestly, particularly at the graduate level, folks that were my peers or just friends and stuff as I was in the undergraduate realm. So certainly dealing with these issues, that's not really a behavioral issue, but dealing with things like that are definitely challenging. So I will say, I think it's important to nip behavioral issues in the bud as quickly as possible. Quite honestly, it's easier to loosen up than it is to tighten up. I do think it's important to kind of establish yourself in the classroom and all that, but you do have a responsibility to kind of hold folks. So first and foremost is I usually, at the beginning of each class, I lay out my syllabus, and over the years I added various things to my syllabi. View the syllabus video, or if you want to see examples, you could email me and I could send you some examples of what I use. But usually I try to lay out my expectations. And obviously my style of teaching, my style of instructing, whatever you want to call it, lecturing, whatever, has changed over the years. But nevertheless, oftentimes I would start out but just kind of laying down what I'm expecting in the classroom and how I expect things to go. And then if there were issues, I would nip it in the bud as quickly as possible. So this kind of goes 2 parts: is laying it out early and then returning to it as you need to. And then also I think it's, basically laying it out at the beginning is critical. So that's kind of like two in one place. The third, would be when something happens is focus on de-escalating, and don't try to, be careful what you do as far as like if you're in a big lecture. So I recall, when the one that I think about most often, I was in a large lecture. It was like 250, 300 people. And I had an older student, non-traditional older student that came, and I don't remember. There was one day, I forget what even happened, but she came in and she talked to me right beforehand because she had a kiddo in her hand, her child in her hand. The child was probably 3 or 4, I don't know, old enough to walk, but not probably school age quite yet. And so she talked to me ahead of class, and it was one of those just kind of like, I was unexpected. And that's how a lot of times these things happen, is it's totally unexpected. But she comes up to me, she says, I couldn't get a babysitter or whatever. I'm going to have my kid in here with me. Is that okay? And I didn't want to say, and this was before Zoom. This is before this was like before all of this technology that we now have. I said, I said, sure. And didn't really know what to expect. Well, in the middle of the class, the child's bouncing off the walls and jumping up and down and all that kind of stuff. And I'm trying to do my best, and I can see students in the class kind of looking over. And my first gut reaction was like, kind of get control of your child here. You're disrupting the class and all that kind of stuff. But then, that was my first inclination. But my second inclination is, I really don't know what's going on or why she had to bring the child or anything like that. And so I actually, there were times that the child would do something and I would, crack a joke or I try to cut the tension in the classroom so that people would be okay and know that I'm okay and that we're gonna make this work. Um, and so after the class, and I was glad I took that approach because after the class, I had a longer conversation with her. And if I remember right, her significant other had been in an accident and was in the hospital, and she was kind of had no family or anything that could help with the child. And so it really spoke to her or meant something to her that I didn't go off, off the rails on her because she's like, I'm so sorry that the child was bouncing off the walls and all that kind of stuff. And I told her, I said, as a one-off, as an emergency situation, I'm glad you felt that you could do that and you asked me and all that. I said, but in the future, if I don't know that it's going to work if we do it again because it was really disruptive. There were a lot of people, looking your direction rather than paying to the content, and I had a hard time lecturing. But for this one-off, it's okay, right? So de-escalate. Don't immediately fly off the handle because I'm a person who can get angry at the drop of a hat. And if I feel like somebody's showing me disrespect, it's something that I struggle with. It's something I can turn on, the doctor, the dean kind of, I can turn that on, and I try not to because I think it can do more damage than good oftentimes. So de-escalate, don't intensify. And then another thing that I like, and it's actually from a book called The Four Agreements, but there's actually another kind of little thing. It's called Qtip, quit taking it personally. And the Four Agreements says don't take it personally. But I like the Q-tip idea because I can always remember like a physical Q-tip. And oftentimes you can use that as a metaphor with people. If you notice somebody who's taking a lot of things personally, give them a Q-tip and then explain the metaphor. Not right at that moment, but it's a way that you can actually communicate that metaphor. So don't take it personally when something happens in the class. You have no idea what could be happening. I'm reminded of another story. It's an analogy. I forget even who told the story, but this idea of not making assumptions. Don't make an error of attribution. In other words, don't attribute to someone's character something that's a result of the current context. And so I'm reminded of a story of a gentleman who was on a subway reading his newspaper, and this father with 3 or 4 kids gets on, and the kids are bouncing all over the subway, and they end up ripping the guy's newspaper, and he's obviously agitated and all that, but he could see that the father looked distressed. And eventually he kind of broke a conversation. The guy with newspaper said something. The guy looked distressed, and the guy that was distressed said, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to explain to my kids that their mom just died. That kind of thing, you never know what's going on in somebody's life. So don't make assumptions that what you're observing is a function of their character. It may be a function of their context that they're currently in, the situation that they're in, what they're going through. You never know what somebody's going. So I kind of, and as I've gotten older, I've gotten better at stopping myself in the midst of a situation like that and asking myself, well, I wonder what that person is going through. Maybe they're just having a bad day. Maybe something terrible happened to them. So anyway, sorry to get stuck on this point 3, but I guess I had a lot to say on it. So how best to address? I think it's best to address, I think you have to take it situationally. If at all possible, if you can address behavioral issues, if they're not severe behavioral issues, like, if it's somebody munching on chips in the middle of your class and you can hear them crunching all the way, it's probably not a good idea to I suppose you could call them out in class if you want to. I would prefer to, like, after class, say something to them, the first time, or if somebody's clipping their nails in class, or somebody comes in with a monster backpack and they've got to get through these rows of people and they're beating everybody with their backpack on the way in, or somebody needs to leave class early and they beat everybody with their backpack on the way out. Those kinds of things, you have to determine how you want to address them. But I oftentimes think unless the pucker factor on it's pretty high, I wouldn't necessarily try to embarrass the person publicly. Now, if it's a repetitive behavior, that might change the situation. If it's something if it's really threatening in the classroom, if it's really, really disruptive, the child example, notwithstanding, it may. So think about how you want to address it. And I would take a pause and think about how you want to approach it. And then lastly, I want to address issues of cheating or integrity issues. So if you think there are integrity issues going on, first and foremost, I would say first you want to make sure that you're absolutely certain, right? You want to do your due diligence. Most institutions like Purdue and other institutions, they have a dean of students office that can process these kinds of situations. I would be very clear at the front of your course what you define as cheating, and how you'll deal with it as well. Some faculty decide to deal with it themselves. Some decide to send it over to a dean of students or some other compliance office to deal with. But you have to do your due diligence and make sure that you can actually show it. And so that's how I would deal with like academic misconduct as it relates to cheating issues. In exam types of scenarios, usually when I used to do large lectures and had large exams, I'd require people to take hats off because they write on the underside of their bill. I'd take sunglasses off because they write on the inside of their sunglasses. I had this long list of things that I would put in my syllabus as well as I would reiterate at an exam time. But then, of course, I had one guy, and I don't remember his name rightly, and he was kind of a character. He liked to kind of poke fun, and he was a fun guy. He didn't do anything malicious. It was always in jest or in fun, and so I kind of played along with him. But in one exam, he came dressed in a Batman mask, and he was just waiting to see if I was going to tell him to take it off. Instead, I just said, "Well, you can wear it the whole exam. I don't care." Because I could see that there was no way for answers to be written on the inside of it and all that. But in the days of cell phones and all these other kinds of technology things, I mean, you have to be really savvy about the ways in which students might decide to try to cheat on exams and other things. But I won't go into all that. Just realize you will have to deal with integrity issues, I promise. So that's the dealing with behavioral issues. So let's talk about relating to your students. And these, I kind of wrote down 5 things that I think are important. And you have to design or develop your own teaching chops, right? You have to design your own persona. I would encourage you not to try to be like somebody else. I've seen faculty that are hard-nosed faculty that are just downright rude in the classroom, but it works for them because they kind of have this military style. And if that's your style, fine. I've seen people that are more conversational. Don't try to be, I mean, you could pick up pieces from other people, but be yourself. Don't try to be something you're not or someone you're not. I mean, it has to kind of align with your personality. Because you can't keep that facade on for very long, right? So first of all, so these are the things that I think mark how I relate to students. First of all, I want to be approachable. Oftentimes I can come off as intimidating. I don't mean to, but it's just that's how it can come off. So I try to focus like at the beginning of classes, talking with students ahead of, in the class before class starts, just chit chat. Now, as an introvert, I absolutely hate it. But over the years, I've learned that does 2 things. Number one, it makes them more comfortable and makes them feel like they can approach me. Second thing that it does is it actually, if I have any kind of nervousness at all, that just all kind of dissipates once I've started to interact with the people. Because you start to connect with them. So approachability, I think, is important. Second would be rapport, making sure that you're able to demonstrate your knowledge, that you're the expert, that, now, even though you're the expert, I still believe in a coaching mentality, that it's not like I'm standing up here, pouring knowledge into your head kind of thing. I still think it's a collaborative effort. But they do have to respect you relative to your knowledge and experience. Third would be care. Oftentimes, and I know it's kind of quick to say, students want to know how much you care before they want to know how much you know. And so I think care is an important thing. It can be a difficult thing to show, and it's a fine line in the classroom of how you show care. But I think a lot of times that's communicated by your efforts in trying to be, number 4, an advocate for the material for them and helping them understand it and trying to make it clear, right? So approachability, rapport, care, advocacy. And then lastly is don't be afraid to share relevant stories and real experiences, because I think this is what can take a course that is incredibly dry and boring. I teach a course that most of the students coming into my course, which is Responsible Conduct of Research, that's the course. I've taught research methods in the past. Taught research methods for 10 years. I've been teaching RCR for about the last 4 or 5 years, I guess. When students come into that class, they look at me like this is the last place on earth they want to be, because it's policy and procedure, and they're required to take it in most cases. But what I found is if you tell stories, real happenings, real things, 1, you reveal yourself. Number 2, it makes it more engaging because it makes it more interesting, because human beings are stories. There were story characters. We love stories. And so part of it is being a good storyteller. I don't know that I was that great at it at the beginning, and I'm not sure that I'm that great of it now, but I try to interject the stories and tell them the way that I would tell them. Now, when you tell stories, you have to make sure you keep confidential parts confidential. I mean, you can't disclose those kinds of things. Um, but real life experiences and stories, I think that's a lot of times why, that's why somebody might choose to be in a live, kind of a live classroom as opposed to pre-recorded distance kind of stuff. I think something happens, pre-recorded distance, I'm not necessarily against that for certain topics. I think it works okay for certain topics, but you lose that human interaction and the story component. If at least if it's synchronous online, you get the stories and some interaction, but I think the best experience is face to face, because I've not had you know, uh, any online experience that replaces that human element, that includes touch, it includes all of the senses, right? Anyway, so I get off that. So that's relating to your students. And then lastly, I want to say something about office hours, and I'll close this up. Usually most institutions will have, at least, they probably won't have it documented, but they'll have some kind of folklore or some kind of, spoken rule of expectations relative to office hours. It's critically important that you find out what that is. As I recall, now I haven't done office hours in this form, almost because I'm in administration all the time. Most of the office hours, I'll meet with students anytime they want to meet, but I don't have just like hours where I sit in my office and I have an open door where they can just come in. So I do require that they email me, schedule it, and all that. But anyway, when I was working as a faculty member, when I did have open office hours, usually it's kind of the expectation that you'd have at least 1 hour of office hours for every 2 hours of class. And now there's different rules and different folklores and different departments and different units and different universities. Find out what it is. Find out what the expectation is so that you can make sure you're abiding by it. Second thing about office hours, don't close your door. Have an open door. When you're meeting with a student, don't shut it all the way. Because you create opportunity for problems. This is something that I was always very conscious of not shutting the door. And it's a matter of practice, because once the door's closed, anybody can say anything happened. So keep the door open. And usually, now there are times where a student will come in. Now, as I've matured in my career, I've been less kind of attentive to that, because the roles in which I serve, people need to tell me highly confidential stories and problems and all that kind of stuff. So I, kind of have to shut the door. But as a general faculty, I don't know that I would do that unless you have a lot of trust built up with that person. And then the other thing is the flip side of that is, if you're in a shared office, make sure you provide some opportunity for private conversations, right? If there are sensitive things that a student needs to, like maybe they have a learning disability, a documented disability, and they need certain accommodations, that needs to be communicated in private. Maybe they're having difficulty, maybe they're getting poor grades and that kind of stuff. You may want communicating that privately. So there are things that need to be in a more private environment, but you can still do so with a cracked door where it's not totally shut. Number 4 and 5 really have to do with grading and the law called FERPA. And so basically being attentive to the rules and regulations surround. So FERPA says that we have to protect student identities and grades and all that kind of stuff, right? I'm not going to go into a long diatribe about FERPA. But 2 important points, I think. First of all, if you're in a shared office, or even if you're not in a shared office, you don't leave graded materials laying around for people to pick up. They have to be, protected. So you either have to hand them back in class or some other mechanism. But you don't leave graded materials sitting outside of your classroom. If you're in a shared environment, you want to make sure you lock those things away, because you have to take a reasonable effort to protect student grades, student privacy, student identity. Second is the other thing that I would say, and this is kind of a 2-parter. First of all, don't email grades. It's advised not to, because although you assume who's on the other end of that email, it's not always true. So first is not sharing grade material. So a lot of times if a student emails me about their grade, and something changed one way or the other, I might give them some cryptic message that they could, I wouldn't say, oh, your grade went from a B to an A or an A to a B. I might say your grade went down 1 letter grade. And they'll know what that means, because they probably would have. So I try to provide cryptic, and if I can't provide enough information, then I just talk to them face to face. Come talk to me at class, or come to my office, and we'll talk about it real quick. So that's one piece of this. The other piece is, particularly when you're working with undergraduates, it's going to happen that a parent is going to contact you about their student, and when we're talking about higher ed, students have to give you permission to give information to their parents, even if their parents are the ones paying for college. This is a frustration point for a lot of parents, including me when my kids were in college. But it's just the way the law works. So I would be hesitant to give information to parents about grades. If somebody wants you to write a letter of recommendation for them and you want to provide information about grades, you need an email from them specifically asking you to include grade information. And that would be, and I'm talking about like GPA, like confirming that they had a GPA of X. You have to be able to do those things, and you have to have permission to do those things. So those are kind of some hodgepodge of kind of like last things that I wanted to share about teaching that I thought were important. So hopefully this series on teaching has been helpful to you. I've kind of exhausted. I had other topics that I thought about talking about, but they get more into learning theory and those kinds of things. I suppose if somebody's interested, or if I run out of topics at some point, I may return to that topic and pick out some of those topics that are more theory oriented. But I really wanted to hit the rubber meets the road kinds of topics for teaching those of you who might be teaching. So from here, my plan is I am going to do, I think, a research proposal or a set of research lectures. And I don't know how long those are going to be. I taught research methods for about 10 years. And so what I'm probably going to do is kind of try to bite off chunks of that to talk about. If you have specific topics you want me to cover, drop me a line either via email, put a comment on the YouTube channel, put a comment in the Grad Connection private Facebook group, and I'll make that a priority. Nobody's really requested topics, except I did have one comment of yes, please do something on research. So that's kind of what I got queued up next. I may take a foray next week and talk about one kind of off, like in between topic, just to give me a break on the series kind of thing. But I will be doing a research series shortly. And I really want to focus on, how do you, first of all, what is research? What's the wide variety of research? Blah, blah, blah. What does a research proposal look like? How do you go about developing a research question? How do you go about, what is a literature review? And how do you go about, picking the things that go in it? How do you decide upon your methodology and how you're going to approach a particular study? And then there's a whole host of other things that we can talk about that opens up. But that's kind of like just off the top of my head, some topics that I might talk about. So with that, it's Friday. For me, it's Friday at 4:10. And this is the last task that I had of this day. I told myself that I was not going to leave the office until I did this. I almost punted, but I don't want to get in the habit of doing that because then it will become a habit. So hopefully you found this series useful. Hope you have a great weekend. And with that, I'll say goodbye.